Hi everyone, welcome to our second lecture. In this lecture, we're going to start to explore the idea of pedagogical documentation. So rather than just looking at straight planning documents or straight assessment documents, we're going to look at how we combine the two to form our pedagogical documentation. So our lecture plan that will explore these topics are pedagogical documentation. We're going to specifically look at these three things that form the basis of our planning and our assessment. So things like floor books, learning journeys, and digital portfolios. We'll then look at assessment of, for, and as learning and how we build on from play. So when we start thinking about how we plan and how we assess, I want you to start with the child. So look at these two gorgeous smiles. We've got Liam and Joe. What do we know about these two little people, and what do we need to find out to effectively plan for them in our school and our centre? We talked previously about how if you run a pure play-based environment that doesn't take into account learning needs, you just let the children progress at their own pace, that's great, but we need to create more of a process for ourselves. So I want you to think about the students on your prac. What did you need to think about when you were organising activities? What did you need to get them to think about? What did your teacher consider? What were all the things that you did? How did you decide what to do in each session? What did you think about when you set up the outdoor spaces? What did you think about when you put things on the tables for the focused activities? Essentially, we have to always have the students at the centre when we are doing our planning, but we also have the context, the needs of the curriculum, the needs of the school, and all the other things that sit around it when we're considering children. So when we're thinking about our planning, how do we authentically show their voice? How do we make sure it's not just us? So the old days of us picking a topic and doing frogs and then making paper frogs and then finding the frogs and then writing a research project on it, that doesn't have the children's voice in it. It has the teacher's voice, and of course the children love the activities and so on, but how do we create that authenticity that shows their voice? So in order to do that, we need to have some core understandings. And the first one is about what is assessment. And then we're going to think about why, how, and what we do with assessment. So assessment for everyone is this idea of the ongoing process, not just the collection point, but it's the process of how we gather the information, which is the part that people obsess over, is the gathering of the information. For me, the more important part is those next two bits that it says. How do we analyse the information, and how do we reflect on the evidence to make our decisions about future student learning? It's not just about gathering information. We can collect a whole lot of data. We can make the most amazing folders full of data. If we're not going through the process of analysing and reflecting on that evidence and then using that to make our informed decisions to improve our future learning, what is the point? So that's why standardised assessments, things like NAPLAN and so on, if they're not used in the right context, they can become quite dangerous in the wrong hands. So you want to make sure that it's just as described in that second quote. It's an activity undertaken to obtain information about knowledge, skills, and attitudes. To me, that's assessment, but when I'm looking at in the classroom, I actually want more of what's described in the first paragraph. I want it to be that process. So if we think about these three things, why do we assess? So are we assessing because we need to provide information for the admin team? Are we assessing because we need to provide information for the parents? Or are we assessing to make sure that we're providing the best experiences for the children? I think that that should be our prime question. So what are we actually assessing? So are we assessing just content? Are we looking at skills? Are we looking at our learning domains? Are we looking at our learning areas? So all of those things need to be what we take into account when we're assessing. Quite often what happens, we assess their number recognition, or we assess their ability to write certain words in some way in a spelling test. But what is that actually giving us as part of that assessment? And our final thing is, when do we assess? Now, the reality is we're actually on a constant process of assessing. When people say, oh, my assessment time is in 4 weeks' time, I'm like, really? Is that the only time you do your assessment? For me, as early childhood educators, we're going through a constant process of assessment, planning, reflecting, analysing, assessing, watching, observing, going through that process constantly. It shouldn't be something that becomes an isolated point in time where we assess and then do nothing with it. Again, it comes back to the idea of what are we actually defining assessment as. So if we look at it from a really broad context, we assess because we want to find out about the children to design the best learning experiences for them. What are we assessing? We're assessing the whole gamut of everything. So we're making sure it's our content, our skills, our domains, our learning areas. And when are we assessing? We're assessing constantly. We have certain points that need to be heavy assessment focused times, particularly if you're in year 1 and 2, then obviously you have assessment times that lead into your reports, but you shouldn't be doing mad assessments all in week 6 so that you can write your reports in week 7. You've lost the point then. Now, if we look at our teaching cycle, this shows us where we can build the assessment elements in. So we're looking at this idea in the centre of ongoing evaluation. And if we go to the top right hand side, what do I want my students to learn? Then we think about how we plan and program for that. How will I get them there? We then put it into practice. How will I know when my students get there? We're looking at our process of assessment and recording. And then you go through, where are my students now? So then we can report to parents, we can report to the admin team, we can report to our leader, that is for our early years in our school, whichever is the process you need for your reporting. But it's a constant cyclical process of going through this ongoing reflection and then going, okay, I'll put this into practice. Oh goodness, that worked. Or, oh wow, no, we need to rethink that. So we have a constant cycle that's going on with our teaching and learning. Now, I know that a lot of schools do this beautifully in our early years. Then what I see, by the time they get to year 2 and 3, it starts to change and we become very much focused on the straight assessing and recording. And we forget about all of those other reflective practices that we want to include. So we want to try and make sure that we are including reflection in there at all points. This is one of my favourite cartoons. And this really summarises the idea of what we're actually looking at when we think about assessment and teaching and the links between them. So a little boy is saying, I taught Stripe how to whistle. The other little boy is looking at Stripe, the dog, and saying, I don't hear him whistling. And the other little boy says, I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And that's my issue when we are focused on our planning processes. We plan and we teach, but if we don't really do that check-in to see whether they understand it, whether they have actually learned it, all of our little children that are in our care, we don't know whether they understand what we have planned for them if we don't check in and make sure it becomes part of our processes. So we really have to ensure that we are doing the right thing of checking all the time to see what's going on. So what are some processes that we can do? Now, the first one is we need to think about how are we documenting this idea of the pedagogical documentation. So what are the things that we use that are authentic and not a test? A lot of teachers get very obsessed with a test. For me, pedagogical documentation is a far more encompassing term rather than assessment or evaluation. Pedagogical documentation is the idea that we use in early childhood, that we don't have a test and then we redesign our activities from that or ignore everything that they don't know and we just move on. but we look at how we're documenting the learning, the processes, the language development, the whole gamut of all of our domains, as well as all of our learning areas. And one of the ones that's rapidly emerging, even more so in the last few years, is this idea of floor books. Now, floor books are a documentation approach. It uses a really large book, and sometimes it's really, really large. Sometimes people are using sheets of big butcher's paper that they then put together. The idea is that the children are able to record aspects of their learning in small groups and sometimes as a whole group. Now, we call it a floor book because it's actually on the floor. It's at child level. It's built on a format that the children can have access to it, but it's also a way that they can then refer to it at different points along in their journey. So those of you that have spent a bit of time in a classroom already, you know how much the kids love to see each other's work, not just their own. And they also love it when parents are able to come into the classroom and have a look at all the work that they've done. I know we have digital portfolios as well, but let's have a look at how we can make it work in a classroom. So we've got a video on the next slide. As we watch, let's have a look at what it has.
This is called the Talking and Thinking Floor Book. They're blank books of large pieces of heavy-duty paper where we can record children's voices and their ideas so we can use them in our planning that we do. This one is what it looks like when children have been working on it. They've designed the front cover, they've signed in their ideas, and through here you can see these are some of their ideas about the way they're going to work and design a landscape. The floor book can be used for any variety of different things. For us, in the work I do, we can use the back of the floor book to show our delivery of the curriculum in a very child-centered way. If you're interested about how to use the floor book in more detail, along with 3D mind mapping and a variety of different strategies, there's soon to be a DVD coming out, so look out for that.
So you can see that Claire in that video explained the features. So if we go through them, the features of that floor book are that they have the children's thoughts and ideas, not just the teachers. And the teacher isn't cherry picking the things that he or she wants to include. It's coming from the children and with the children. We've got open-ended questions so the children can contribute to it. We want to be able to demonstrate lots of high-order thinking in there, not just 26 frogs all with bouncing legs on them. We want to be able to show the depth and the breadth of the children's learning to make sure that they've got lots of different ways that they can represent their thinking. So it could be through photos that they have taken, it could be through images that they find, it could be through a collection of materials they've actually found outside and added in. If you were looking at things like where do things grow, and we look at sand and we look at our trees and we look at our bark and our leaves and so on. The children can write or draw, the adult can glue. We can also use scribing of some sort to add in some notes. We can put in our conversations that children have had. And we want to make sure that the book is available to the children at all times. There might be certain times that they can contribute to the book. It might be a outdoor or related to a particular centre that you've set up. It's about making sure that you have opportunities for them to add to the book in some way. Now, our next thing that we think about is our learning journeys. Now, we talk about learning being a journey, but what we want to be able to do in an early years room and in a primary room is to document that learning. So it could be using the floor books as part of it. It could also be how do we actually use our display spaces in the room to ensure that we can show the progress of learning as well. The important thing with the learning journey is that it's not just the end product, but you actually want to be able to show every part of the process. That's really important, particularly in our early years, because sometimes when you look at a thing that a 4 or 5-year-old has produced, yeah, it can look a bit weird and wonderful, can't it? But you want to be able to show each part of the process. not just the final product, which might not look fabulous, or it might look fabulous, but it was heavily scaffolded all the way through so the students could actually achieve something. So you want to potentially have some way of explaining that to the parents. Now that can be through a variety of different means. I have lots of schools that I've worked with that have parent evenings, and the children show their progress of learning over a period of time, and they invite the parents in to have their learning journey evening. And they might then have some type of guided process that they use to show their mum and dad or their caregivers what's gone on in their room, and their siblings as well. Sometimes they quite like bringing their big brothers or little brothers and sisters in. So now our next thing, of course, we are seeing more and more is our digital portfolios. So our digital portfolios, Seesaw is the most common one. So all of our Catholic schools have access to a paid version of Seesaw. A lot of our government schools, they use it as well. Some will have the free, some will have the paid version. Our independent schools have either Seesaw or some other one that they have been using as well. You might find some schools use another app like Shobi, or if they are in middle and upper primary, sometimes they're using something like OneNote with our older students. Generally, you won't find your early years using OneNote. It's not really developmentally appropriate. Now, Seesaw is designed to share with parents, but it also provides a fabulous portfolio for you of their work. It's very easy for you to quickly take photos and share it with the parents. What you need to be aware of with Seesaw though is you don't want to bombard the parents with too many notifications, and also you don't want to only put up the best work on Seesaw or only put up the process. You want to make sure that it is showing the entire learning journey. So there are our main ways that we would actually be able to document learning in some way. So let's think about why are we doing it. So we're doing it essentially to, first of all, monitor their development and learning. So if we're going to use our floor books, we're showing that development and we're showing the learning they've had as part of that context of whichever is the thing that they're exploring. We're then using our planning and our documentation to guide future planning and decision making about the experiences that we're going to design. We're looking at what does an individual child need, or what does this group of children need? And then we're using our documentation to make sure that we can report and we can communicate with others. Now that others, it could be external agencies such as a speech therapist or an OT. It could be with our caregivers. It could be with our school itself to make sure that they're monitoring what's going on with all of the pre-primaries. It could even be at system level. So as a result of some government initiatives a year or so ago, every single school now has to provide their grades for every single child back to their relevant educational institution. So we need to make sure that we are providing all of those. We can't assume that any child fits into our expectations of learning and development. We must use different areas of pedagogical documentation to record, reflect, to go through that cycle constantly. Our assessment information is always essential when we are planning and implementing a developmentally appropriate program. We can't just go, oh, I want to do whatever. We have to look at what the children need, what we would like them to be able to explore, and then how we make sure that we map to the learning demands that are sometimes applied externally on us. Now, sometimes standardized tests have prescribed ways of reporting to parents, and that's okay, but we need to make sure that we are using appropriate means to report back to the main caregivers. So what are we actually looking at when we're gathering information? So we're looking at the major child growth and development domains. We're looking at whether they're meeting their milestones. We're looking at whether they're actually doing what we expect at that age. And if they're not, Are we going to intervene? How are we going to deal with it in a different way? We're looking at what did we expect to come out of the program. Now, sometimes the children do way more than we expect, and sometimes things don't quite hit the mark the same way that we expect them to. So we've got to make sure that our assessment links to the objectives of our lessons. So what's our expected outcome? Does the data that we're collecting show us whether they have met that or not? And then different children and different contexts, they develop differently. So I might have this amazing thing that worked beautifully the previous year. I try it with a new group of children, it bombs. And then the weirdest thing they love. So you'll set up something really random in your dramatic play area, and you will just get this rich set of language and discussions and play that is coming out of that. And you also want to think, how are you being able to identify and articulate any problems or concerns that you have? So what about that child who is always sitting in the block corner and will never come out of the block corner? Any time that you have any time where they're able to make choices about things, that's their only place that they go to. And getting them to do anything else is very difficult. So how are you going to be able to identify that? What are we going to do? How are we recording all of our records? So when we think about when we're assessing, we always want to think about just all the time. We assess and we record data at the start of a program. We record data all the way along. We look at before and after, where we've had intentional teaching, a concentrated emphasis on some elements and so on. So essentially we're recording all the time. It's not that we're recording data needlessly. We want to be very clear. So our assessment principles from SCASA talk to us and say, if we're designing assessments that we're going to use with children, we need to make sure that our assessment matches these 5 assessment principles. We make sure that it is valid, as in it's relevant for the children and it works. We make sure it's educative, meaning it's going to help with their learning. We make sure it's fair. Fair is a really interesting word that we use, because we need to make sure that it is fair for all the children in our class and for the children regardless of where they are and what they're able to do. We've all seen the things where you would, if a fish judged itself by its ability to climb a tree, it would always fail. Whereas if we look at how we design something that is fair for all the children in our class, it might not be for every single child to do the same assessment. How excruciatingly demoralizing would it be if a child is on an IEP and they have great difficulty sounding out and saying certain words, but we're giving them the same Year 2 test that all of the other children are doing? We know they can't do it. Why put them through that process? Make it fair. Give them something that they can show their growth in. We need to make sure it is always explicit. That is, always the assessment criteria is clearly stated, and that we're not testing them just to see if they can do it. No, we don't do that. We make sure that all of our assessment is comprehensive. So we don't include just one narrow element. We make sure that it is included across the board in some way. So they're our core principles from SCASA. Now, when we look at our criteria, we also want to make sure it's valid. We want to make sure it's reliable. So can the assessment be used with a different group of children? Does it give a consistent result? And so on. Is it manageable? So things like on-entry testing that you do at the beginning of pre-primary, that needs to be done one-on-one for every single child within the first few weeks of school in pre-primary. You wouldn't want to do that every 3 or 4 weeks, would you? It needs to be something that's done when it's manageable, and that's something that schools plan for. So they organise relief and they work out different ways that they can make sure it works. Now, is it trustworthy? So has it come from a reliable source? Is it something that you want to be able to use? Is it credible? Is it transferable? Is it something that was developed in the US and then when we look at it we go, well, no, that's not going to work for Australia, and so on. And then finally, is it authentic? So we have to make sure that it suits the needs of our stakeholders and whoever is involved in the assessment process. So we've got to make sure we use that 5 criteria in a nice, consistent manner for always, every time that we're thinking about our assessment. So oftentimes you will hear educators use the terms assessment and evaluation interchangeably. They're not. So assessment is the gathering of the data. So we gather and record the information constantly. Evaluation is the judgment part of it. It's where we make the judgments about the information that we are gathering. So we then take it and we work out the conclusions about the progress of the students and their effectiveness. It's where the process of reflection comes in. Assessment is just the gathering. If we only gather the data without the evaluation, we don't make the change. So we have to make sure that we're assessing, gathering the information, and we're then evaluating, where we're going through the process of making sure that we're looking at why that happened. We're telling the story of the data. We're looking at, do we need to change something, and will the data change? What's the data showing us? The analysis of the data for me is the most important part, because otherwise we don't know whether what we're doing is useful or not. So let's look at our assessment for, of, and as learning. So assessment for learning is when we use inferences about the student progress to inform our teaching. So we're going, the children need more work on these sounds, so therefore I'm going to build that into my planning. Assessment as learning is when the students have more agency and they're monitoring their own progress. So the students are actually contributing to the floor book and they're saying, oh, look at this, we've found all of these things that are leaves, and we can see all these different types of shapes in our environment. We can see all of these shapes and which ones have edges and which ones have corners and so on. So they're reflecting and monitoring their own progress. Assessment of learning is often the one that we tend to focus on the most, where we look at evidence of their learning and we make judgments against our goals and our standards. If we only do assessment of learning, we're missing those opportunities where we're using it for learning and we're using it as learning. So we need to make sure that we blend all three. If we look at it from another point of view, assessment for learning is our diagnostic assessment. We're looking at what do the children need to be able to do. Assessment as learning forms under our formative assessment. And assessment of learning is far more related to oftentimes our summative assessment, where we're wrapping it up and we're saying, okay, this is what they can actually do. As you can see, if we only assess at the end, we miss the richness of all the other data. So we have to make sure that we use assessment of learning to guide our assessment for learning, involve the children in the assessment as learning, which will then develop much better assessment of learning, and so on. So we want it to be part of that cyclical process. So in wrapping up this introduction to our pedagogical documentation with a focus on the beginnings of assessment, let's have a look at our final thoughts. Pedagogical documentation includes a wide range of ideas and processes. We look today at floor books, at our digital portfolios, and making sure that we collect a wide variety of data. We don't want to make sure that we confuse the what, as in the thing we've collected, with the how and the process that the children have actually used. So that's why a learning journey is an important pedagogical documentation, because it allows us to see the how they got there and what they achieved. And whatever we do with our pedagogical documentation with a focus on our assessment, we need to make sure that we have as, of, and for learning. not just focusing on the of learning. All right, so now if we move into our tutorial, we've got, in our tutorial, we're looking at different assessment forms and what we could potentially use as our collection modes and bringing in the broader concepts of it. We're going to look at our objectives and how they link to our assessment, and we're going to look at how we plan for and with the children.